I'm going to follow a lot of what Jillian was talking about. A number of the themes that she brought up on PFAS are also themes that are going to come up in my presentation. But I just want to sort of underline something at the beginning, that we're sort of talking here about the nexus of science and policy, but I also want to add corporate tactics. We want the best science to inform the best policy, and it should be that way. But if we're not reflecting a little bit on the investments being made to disrupt that relationship, we're coming at it a little bit naive. And so I want to talk through a little bit about how PFAS came into focus in the communities I work with and actually live in, how we built up some work around that, and how the companies that were responsible for the contamination tried to shift all the responsibility for PFAS contamination onto the community that was most impacted by it. So that's the sort of the arc of what I'm going to be talking about here for the next 10 minutes. PFAS was discovered first in Hoosick Falls in 2015, and then very quickly in Bennington and Petersburg, New York. A couple things when it first came to light in our community. PFOA and PFOS were the focus. Those were the ones that the EPA had issued some drinking water guidance levels on, and those were the ones that we kind of initially started focusing on. Very quickly, though, in the subsequent years, we realized that there's this family of compounds, PFAS families, of some 15,000 synthetic chemicals. And as said earlier in the previous presentation, these are not found in nature. These are synthetic chemicals that are produced in factories, and they're marked by a carbon-fluorine bond. That's one of the strongest chemical bonds known. And once it's produced, almost nothing breaks it apart. And this is the real issue. This is why a number of groups have started referring to these chemicals as forever chemicals, because the synthetic fluorine carbon bond at the core of them, once it's produced, it's almost impossible to get it to break down. So, 2015, PFOA discovered in groundwater of Hoosick Falls and then Petersburg and Bennington at alarmingly high levels that were well in excess of the EPA's guidance levels at the time. The EPA guidance level at the time was 400 parts per trillion for PFOA. And it was discovered in the groundwater of Hoosick Falls, the drinking water source in Hoosick Falls, at 600 to 700 parts per trillion, so well above that. And the EPA's guidance level has just gone down since then. And in New York, it's currently, I think, at 10 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. Groundwater is a primary drinking water source in the region, and these chemicals were everywhere we looked for them in groundwater, we found them. Bennington College, where I teach, we were able to secure $500,000 from the National Science Foundation to support civic science in the impacted communities. This is a picture from Hoosick Falls. It's a Little League game. And if you look just to the right above the fence and up, that's a well. That's the primary well, the drinking water source for the community of Hoosick Falls. You can't see it in the picture, but just behind the tree line is the St. Gobain plastics plant. And for decades and decades, that St. Gobain plastic plant was dumping PFAS, both emitting it, but also just dumping their chemicals in the field right on those trees. Guess what happened? It all ended up in the aquifer and in the drinking water. What do we do with the money from the National Science Foundation? We very quickly started offering classes free of charge to the public, co-taught by a chemist, a geologist, and myself. We tried to give the community a kind of primer on what are these chemicals, what are their properties, what should we be concerned about, what's happening in policy worlds to address them. And this class was filled with local legislators, public school teachers, mothers, water managers, local journalists, all of whom were trying to get up to speed on these chemicals, which initially sound they're very technical. It sounds like a very foreign thing, and it takes some work to figure out the properties of them and how we might better address the risks they really pose to our communities. We also started collecting community questions and trying to put research teams together of students and faculty to produce data for the community. PFOA, my maple syrup. Yes, yes, it is. We checked a number of maple trees and found PFOA in the sap. PFOA in pool, questions about illegal dumping sites that we went and would go and test soil, groundwater, and found a number of hotspots all around. We also did a PFAS community health survey after a number of folks were really concerned about the number of people they knew in the community with testicular cancer and kidney cancer, two of the cancers that were associated with exposure to PFAS. So we went around and tried to just document in the community what the community knew of its own health to make sure that was part of some of the bigger conversations about how to respond to this issue. That's sort of the arc of a lot of the work we did. It's summarized a lot, but I also want to start talking about some of the, the new problems that these chemicals pose, these forever chemicals pose. These are things that I've learned through working with the communities, working in Hoosick Falls and Bennington since 2015, but also being invited to work with a number of other communities that are finding these chemicals in their drinking water. And these are some of the things that I've started to learn from working with these communities. PFAS toxicity is pushing at the edges of existing science and policy. And I just kind of want to summarize 4 little points where I think PFAS toxicity is pushing at the edge of some of the ways we do science and some of the ways we do environmental policy in the US. For a very long time, there was a presumption that the biological reactivity of a chemical was a kind of proxy of its toxicity. The more reactive a chemical was, the more toxic it was presumed to be. PFAS don't follow this model. PFAS are incredibly inert. Their widespread use in manufacturing was because they didn't react to anything. They're incredibly slippery. They don't react. They're just inert. But the ways in which they're inert is introducing a new kind of author of toxicity and harm to biological systems. That doesn't quite fit the script of reactivity. One way, they're slightly different. 2, thresholds may not be the most effective approach. In a lot of the studies done by the EPA in a number of states, there was no level of exposure under which there was no effects. There was no point at which they stopped seeing effects in the test they were looking at. This is PFAS, we should all know, right, has been pushing a lot of the guidance levels for drinking water into an entirely new metric, parts per trillion. I mean, the concern level in drinking water is parts per trillion, which is worth stopping and pausing and thinking about for a second when we're having drinking water advisory levels at parts per trillion. 3rd, exposure and impact are not fixed in place. PFAS, once they're released into the environment, are extremely mobile. They move around, and they have delayed health effects on exposed populations. Lastly, the 4th one is that EPA, our model of sort of regulating dangerous chemicals, toxic chemicals, it still regulates individual chemicals one at a time. And each chemical takes about a decade to begin to build up advisory levels and regulations around. The entire PFAS family consists of about 15,000 individual chemicals. It's widely presumed that they share certain toxic properties. And we have a lot, I think, to learn from Europe right now, where Europe is beginning to regulate families of compounds. And we could very easily begin to regulate all of the PFAS compounds instead of the one by one. If we follow the one by one, regulating each chemical by individual chemical by individual chemical by individual chemical, it's estimated it will take several hundred years to get our way through the entire PFAS family. Some of the things I've learned from communities that are impacted, that are living this disaster day in and day out, are not, they don't resign themselves to these problems. And I've taken tremendous inspiration from them and the demands they're putting out. Some of the things they're demanding is to ban all PFAS. Let's just ban it right now. Let's stop dumping all PFAS into our environment. Find every source of PFAS that's coming into our communities and let's stop it. And let's hold the polluters accountable. Some of the publications that I've put out that Doug was mentioning, where I sort of talk through some of this work, if folks are interested, are a number of pieces in The Guardian, an article in Environmental Science, Processes and Impact about airborne deposition from plastics factories, and then also a piece in American Ethnologist. And this is the way I kind of summarize some of the insights from PFAS. After the briefest moment of practical utility, PFAS compounds come to haunt life with roving mobility, torpid toxicity, and a monstrous immortality. Exposure to trace amounts of these forever chemicals is strongly linked to a host of cancers, developmental disorders, immune dysfunction, and infertility. And this is to say that there is urgent work to be done to ban PFAS right now, stop all inputs of PFAS into our communities, and hold those who profited from PFAS accountable for cleaning up the mess. I want to sort of move on into the corporate tactics. That's the sort of work I've done sort of in the community. We've been drawn into sort of trying to address the corporate tactics around PFAS. The insights we have about PFAS are hard won. The ways that we're learning more and more about the harms of PFAS, the dangers they pose to communities, these are hard-won insights. But we should never lose sight of the fact that the industry that produced PFAS had robust documentations of the dangers they posed almost from the moment they started producing them. I won't go through it all, but here's a quick list from the DuPont archive. Sharon Lerner has a great expose, a series, the Teflon toxin that she had in The Intercept before she went to ProPublica. From the beginning, DuPont was amassing serious documentation of all of the harms of PFAS onto its workers and then onto the communities downriver of its factory. Every time they got this information, they did not share it, they hid it away. And the reason we're in the place we're in is in part because of the corporate deception of hiding all of the documentation of the harms of these chemicals. In my community, Hoosick Falls and Bennington, when PFAS was first discovered, there was a whole kind of campaign of corporate social responsibility, a ubiquitous charm offensive, I called it. Saint-Gobain, the plastics factory that's responsible for most of the PFAS contamination, bought up the online domains hoosickwater.com and benningtonwater.com, and they sort of broadcast all of the good-sounding things that they were thinking about doing. What was happening behind the scenes? Saint-Gobain released the conceptual site model investigation. This is the first step in investigating the extent of contamination. It came in at 7,377 pages, and it made 3 claims. This is the company that was sort of seen as responsible for emitting PFAS by the ton into our community. First, that our region had high levels of background, that is non-attributable PFAS in soil and water. Second, that local residents, farmers and small businesses were a significant contributor to PFAS contamination in our region. And third, the distinctive chemical signature of PFAS emissions from the plastics factory was no longer identifiable in our region's soil and water. What does this add up to? That local residents are the real authors of PFAS contamination, not the industries that produced them, not the industries that sold them to consumers while hiding the facts they knew of their dangers. None of those people are responsible. The people who took or used small amounts are the ones that are really responsible. We published a series in the Vermont Digger with students. I published this trying to sort of document this and sort of pull these folks into some accountability. This is sort of the big takeaway I have. The industries that have profited immensely from PFAS, I mean, astronomical profits from PFAS. The industries that have profited immensely from PFAS while hiding the dangers of PFAS are now hard at work shifting all responsibility for the health and environmental fallout of PFAS onto impacted communities. And as folks begin to face up to PFAS and try to confront this issue, it's important to be aware of how the industries that have profited from these dangerous chemicals are pushing all responsibility for the fallout of them on to residents and communities themselves. That's my sort of quick summary, and delighted to be here in conversation with you, Doug, and with the community here.